I still remember the morning when everything started to unravel. It was the kind of bright, peaceful day that tricks you into believing life is normal, that you have control over things. The sun had just begun to filter through the blinds of our small, two-story suburban house, the kind of place where lawns are trimmed to perfection and everyone waves while secretly keeping score. I had lived in that neighborhood for almost 6 years, a modest, HOA-controlled community tucked just outside of Denver. It wasn't paradise, but it was home, or at least, it had been until that week when my son's life hung in the balance, and one woman decided that her neighborhood rules mattered more than a child's heartbeat. My son, Liam, was 6 years old. He was born with a congenital heart defect that required regular monitoring and, in recent months, a life-saving operation that had already been delayed twice due to complications with insurance and hospital scheduling. My wife, Melissa, and I had spent the better part of that year living in a fog of anxiety. Every night was filled with quiet dread, every morning with forced optimism. We had scraped together every dollar we could find. I had taken on weekend electrical repair jobs on top of my main contracting work, while Melissa worked part-time at the elementary school just to keep the insurance valid. We weren't rich, but we were resilient, and nothing mattered more than keeping our little boy alive. The surgery was finally scheduled for the following Friday at the Children's Hospital downtown. The doctors wanted Liam under observation in advance, so we had to install temporary home medical equipment in his bedroom, a heart rate monitor, oxygen regulator, and a small portable unit that helped regulate his breathing during sleep. The machines weren't loud, but they gave off a faint hum at night, a sound that became both comforting and terrifying to us. I had set up the wiring carefully myself, with the help of the hospital technician. Everything was inspected, approved, and safe. For us, it was hope in electronic form, a bridge until the surgery could give our boy a normal life. But then came Karen. Her real name was Margaret Reynolds, though no one dared call her that without bracing for a lecture. She was the self-appointed enforcer of our homeowners association, the kind of person who printed the community rules on laminated sheets and slipped them under doors, just as a reminder. She wasn't officially on the HOA board anymore, she'd been removed after too many complaints, but that didn't stop her from patrolling the streets with a clipboard and a phone camera like some kind of suburban sheriff. She thrived on control, on catching others in small violations. She once reported a neighbor for leaving trash cans out 2 hours past collection time. Another time, she wrote a 3-page complaint because someone's lawn gnome was not in keeping with community aesthetics. When I first met her, I had tried to be civil. I thought she was just eccentric, lonely, maybe trying to fill her time. But over the years, she turned into a daily source of tension, picking fights over parking spaces, questioning everyone's landscaping, even yelling at neighborhood kids for playing basketball in driveways. Still, I never imagined she'd go as far as she eventually did. The trouble started 2 days after we installed the medical equipment. She came knocking at our door mid-morning, clipboard in hand, her sharp blonde bob swinging like a warning sign. I remember Melissa answering the door, trying to keep her voice calm, while Liam was inside coloring with his medical monitor quietly beeping beside him. Karen didn't even say hello. Her first words were, "You're violating Section 8, subparagraph 3 of the HOA electrical regulations." Melissa blinked in confusion. "Excuse me?" "The wiring on the side of your house," Karen said, pointing toward the small conduit I'd run from the backup generator. "It's not approved by the HOA. You can't make external modifications without written consent." Melissa tried to explain that it wasn't a modification, just a temporary setup approved by the hospital, essential for our son's treatment. But Karen wasn't listening. She just kept talking, flipping through papers, citing rules. It didn't matter that she wasn't on the board. She'd appointed herself as the voice of authority. Finally, I stepped in, wiping grease off my hands from a project I'd been working on in the garage. "Karen," I said as evenly as I could, "this equipment is medical. My son needs it. We have hospital authorization. Please, just let it be." She crossed her arms, eyes narrowing like I'd just challenged a dictator. "Rules are rules, Mr. Anderson. If everyone starts running wires and machines, the whole neighborhood will look like a junkyard. It's not personal, it's about keeping order. I stared at her, barely believing what I was hearing. It is personal. You're talking about my kid's life. She just shrugged and walked away, saying something about filing an incident report. I thought it was empty talk. She'd made threats before, but I never imagined she'd act on them. That night, though, things took a darker turn. Around midnight, the monitor alarm in Liam's room started flashing. Melissa ran in, her voice breaking with panic. I rushed after her and saw that the oxygen unit had powered off. The main plug had been disconnected, not pulled out by accident, but carefully unplugged. I checked the wiring outside and found the extension cord leading from the backup generator had been cut clean through. The edges weren't frayed, they'd been sliced. For a few moments, I just stood there staring at the severed wire under the moonlight, the cold realization crawling over me. Someone had done this on purpose. I looked toward the end of the street, and there she was, Karen, standing by her driveway, her phone in hand, pretending to take pictures of her flowers. When our eyes met, she turned and walked inside. My anger shook so violently I could barely breathe. I wanted to march right over and demand answers, but Melissa stopped me, clutching my arm. "Please," she whispered, "Liam first." She was right. We reconnected the power using a spare line and stayed up all night watching our son's heartbeat flicker on the monitor. The next morning, I reported the incident to the HOA and the local police. The officer who came by, a tired-looking guy named Thompson, took notes but seemed reluctant. "You got any proof she did it?" he asked. I pointed toward the clean cut on the wire. "Someone used a blade. She's the only one who's been complaining." He sighed. "I'll file it, but without video, it's just suspicion." That's when I decided to install a camera of my own, a discreet, motion-activated one by the side of the house. I hoped that would be enough to deter her, or at least catch her if she tried again. For a while, things went quiet. Karen would glare from across the street, sometimes muttering under her breath about code violations, but she kept her distance. I tried to focus on Liam, on keeping the house calm. The surgery date was approaching, and we couldn't afford more stress. Then, 3 days before the operation, everything exploded. I had gone to pick up a prescription from the pharmacy. Melissa stayed home with Liam. Around 4 p.m., I got a frantic call, her voice trembling, half crying, half shouting. "She's in the yard, she's touching the equipment." I dropped everything and sped home. When I pulled up, I saw Karen crouched beside the generator, screwdriver in hand, unscrewing the protective cover I had bolted shut. Melissa was yelling at her from the porch to stop, but Karen just kept talking about unsafe modifications. I jumped out of the truck, adrenaline burning through me. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Karen straightened up, unfazed. "You're endangering everyone's safety." "I'm correcting a violation. This equipment isn't HOA approved. It could cause a fire. It's hospital equipment." I shouted. "Authorized by medical staff. You're trespassing." She actually smirked. "If you'd followed the rules, I wouldn't have to intervene." Before I could respond, Liam's monitor alarm went off again from inside the house, that awful beeping sound that freezes your blood. Melissa ran inside, screaming his name. I pushed past Karen, nearly tripping over the cable she'd loosened, and rushed in after my wife. Liam was pale, gasping. The oxygen regulator had dropped pressure. I reconnected it, hands shaking, as Melissa tried to soothe him through tears. The hospital called us back within the hour, insisting we bring Liam in early for emergency observation. We rushed him to the ER, the drive blurring into sirens and tears. I stayed at the hospital overnight, refusing to leave his side. That's when the doctor, a calm but firm man named Dr. Vasquez, asked me to explain what had happened with the equipment. I told him everything, the HOA, the interference, the tampering. He went quiet for a moment, then said something that chilled me. You realize that kind of interference is a criminal act. If someone deliberately tampered with medical support equipment, that's attempted harm. We're required to report it. He made the call right then. The next morning, 2 officers showed up at our house, not to question me, but to question Karen Reynolds. The camera I'd installed had recorded everything, her cutting the cable, unscrewing the panel, even smirking toward the window afterward. The footage was crystal clear. When the officers confronted her, she tried to claim she was inspecting a safety hazard, but the evidence spoke for itself. They placed her under arrest right there on her pristine driveway while half the neighborhood peeked through curtains. It should have felt like justice, but all I felt was exhaustion, and fear for Liam. The operation went ahead the next day. It lasted 6 hours. Every minute in that waiting room felt like a lifetime. When the surgeon finally came out and smiled, saying the words, "successful procedure," I broke down completely. Melissa did too. We held each other, knowing that our boy was safe, but the scars that week left on us would never really heal. I thought the nightmare was over. I thought once Karen was charged, we could finally breathe. But I was wrong. That was only the beginning. The days after the surgery felt strangely hollow, like the air itself had been drained from our home. Liam was recovering in the hospital, hooked up to wires and monitors again, but this time it was different. There was hope in the numbers now, a steady rhythm in the beeps that replaced the constant anxiety we'd lived with for months. Melissa stayed with him most of the time, sleeping on the fold-out chair by his bed, while I went back and forth between the hospital and home, juggling work, bills, and police calls. Every time I looked at our quiet house, I saw the cut wires, the broken trust, the reminders of what Karen had done. The police investigation moved slowly, as they always do. Officer Thompson, the same man who'd brushed off my earlier report, came back, this time with a different tone. He'd seen the footage, spoken with the hospital, and realized this wasn't just another neighborhood spat. He told me they were forwarding charges to the district attorney, trespassing, destruction of property, and reckless endangerment. But as much as that sounded like justice, I knew Karen wouldn't make it easy. People like her rarely do. Word spread fast around the neighborhood. You could feel it in the way curtains twitched when I walked by, in the awkward smiles from neighbors who didn't know which side to take. Some people quietly reached out to offer support, others avoided me like I carried bad luck. One evening, while I was fixing the fence near our driveway, old Mr. Henson from across the street shuffled over with his cane and said softly, "She's been trouble for years, son. You did what you had to do." His voice trembled, but his eyes were sincere. Still, for every kind word, there were whispers, people saying things like, "Maybe he overreacted," or, "It's just an HOA dispute gone too far." But it wasn't a dispute. It was an attack on my child. Melissa came home briefly that weekend to shower and change. I could see the fatigue in her face, the dark rings under her eyes, but also something else, relief. She smiled faintly and said, "He's breathing better now. The doctors say his heart rhythm is stable." I hugged her, holding on longer than usual, feeling the weight of everything we'd endured. Yet even in that quiet moment, I couldn't escape the image of Karen standing smugly in her yard, clipboard in hand, acting like she was above consequence. 2 days later, I got a knock on the door. It wasn't the police this time, it was the HOA president, Tom Ellison. He was a middle-aged man with a soft voice and a habit of looking down when he spoke, like he was afraid of confrontation. He carried a folder under his arm, full of neatly printed forms and official-looking seals. "Mr. Anderson," he said, clearing his throat, "I wanted to discuss the recent incident." I folded my arms. If this is about the equipment, it's been removed. My son's in the hospital now. He shifted uncomfortably. "No, it's not that. It's about the arrest. Margaret, Mrs. Reynolds, is claiming she was acting under the impression that your setup was hazardous. She's filed a grievance with the board, accusing you of harassment and defamation." I stared at him in disbelief. She broke into my property, cut medical wires, and nearly killed my son, and I'm the one being accused. He winced. Look, personally, I think what she did was unacceptable. But as president, I have to process her claim. I could feel the anger rising again. Then process this, I'm suing her. And if the HOA tries to protect her, I'll include you in it. Tom looked startled, then sighed. Just, keep everything documented. And for what it's worth, I hope your boy gets better. That was the last civil conversation I had with anyone from that board. The next few weeks were a blur of recovery and paperwork. Liam's operation was a success, but he needed rest, medication, and routine follow-ups. The doctors warned us to avoid stress and keep the environment calm, as if that were possible with a pending court case and a neighborhood full of gossips. I had never imagined that healing my son's heart would come hand in hand with tearing open every nerve in my own. Karen was released on bail a few days after her arrest. Her husband, a quiet, weary man named Frank, posted it. I saw her back on her porch within a week, pretending to water her plants, though she'd clearly set up her phone to record my house from across the street. It was harassment in plain sight, but I didn't take the bait. I'd already installed more cameras and motion lights, determined that this time she wouldn't touch a single wire without being caught again. Then came the court summons, not from the police, but from the HOA. They were holding a special meeting to discuss my alleged hostile conduct toward a fellow resident. The irony was nauseating. Melissa wanted me to ignore it, but I couldn't. I showed up, armed with printouts of police reports, photos, and the full time-stamped video of her tampering. The meeting was held in the community center, beige walls, coffee stains on the carpet, and a handful of board members seated behind folding tables. Karen was there too, sitting smugly with a binder of her own, acting like the victim. When my turn came to speak, I didn't hold back. I described the night the oxygen failed, the sound of my son gasping for breath, the cut cable under the moonlight. I played the security footage, letting the projector fill the wall with her image, crouched beside my generator, slicing through the cord with deliberate precision. The room went silent. Even Tom couldn't meet her eyes. When it ended, Karen stood up, red-faced but defiant. "This is being taken out of context," she said. "I was ensuring compliance with safety standards. That setup was a hazard to everyone. If anything had happened to his son, it would have been his fault for using unapproved equipment." My fists clenched at my sides. "You mean the hospital-certified equipment that kept him alive? That hazard?" She glared at me, lips thin. "You're an electrician, aren't you? Maybe you rigged it wrong." The words hit like a punch. For a moment, I actually saw red. It took everything in me not to yell. Instead, I turned to the board and said, "If this is the kind of person you choose to represent your community, then I want nothing to do with it. I'll be moving as soon as my son is strong enough." The board voted 4-1 to suspend her HOA privileges indefinitely, the lone no vote coming from her closest friend. It was a small victory, but it didn't erase what had happened. She was still free, still across the street, still capable of more damage. Around that time, something unexpected happened. Dr. Vasquez, the physician who had called the police, reached out to me personally. He told me the hospital had filed a separate report through their legal department, since tampering with medical equipment falls under a federal category of interference. "You might be entitled to compensation," he said gently, "but more importantly, this sets a precedent. What she did was more than harassment, it was medical endangerment." That gave me a flicker of hope, not for money, but for accountability. Melissa and I met with a lawyer recommended by the hospital, a calm, sharp-minded woman named Erica Fields. She reviewed the evidence and nodded slowly. "This is a strong case," she said. "You're not just protecting your family, you're making sure this kind of person can't harm anyone else." Filing the civil suit reignited everything. Karen doubled down. She started a whisper campaign, spreading lies about us neglecting our son, claiming we'd used illegal wiring, even suggesting we'd exaggerated the story for attention. Some neighbors bought into it. One woman at the grocery store muttered, "Not everything's about you, you know," as I passed her in the aisle. It felt like being exiled in plain sight. Then one afternoon, I caught Karen standing by the community bulletin board, posting a flyer titled, "Protect Our Neighborhood from Unsafe Modifications." It included a blurred photo of my generator setup, the same one she'd tampered with, along with a line about irresponsible residents endangering others. My hands shook as I tore it down. I confronted her right there on the sidewalk. "You still don't get it, do you?" I said through clenched teeth. "You could have killed my son." Her expression didn't change. "And you still don't get that this isn't about your son. It's about order. People like you ruin communities." That word, order, stuck with me. It was her religion. She worshipped control more than she valued human life. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't just about her obsession, it was about how power warps ordinary people into monsters when they're given a clipboard and a rulebook. Weeks turned into months. The criminal trial date was set. Liam's health improved day by day, and we started talking about moving. But before we could, something happened that nearly broke us again. One night, around 11 p.m., I heard a noise outside, a metallic clang, followed by the faint crunch of gravel. I checked the camera feed from my phone, and my blood ran cold. The motion detector showed a silhouette near the side of the house, not Karen this time, but someone smaller, wearing a hoodie. I rushed outside with a flashlight, yelling, "Hey! Get out of here!" The figure bolted, disappearing into the dark. When I checked the ground, I found a note taped to the fence. It read, "You think you're the victim, but we're tired of your drama. Leave before you ruin this place for everyone." I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I installed floodlights, reinforced the locks, and filed another police report. Officer Thompson came again, shaking his head. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest, Mr. Anderson," he said quietly. "Be careful." Melissa wanted to move immediately, but our finances were tied up, legal fees, hospital bills, lost work hours. Still, I promised her that once the court case ended, we'd leave for good. During the hearing, Karen tried every tactic, denial, justification, even tears. Her lawyer argued she'd been acting out of civic duty, but the video evidence and hospital testimony crushed that narrative. When the judge finally ruled in our favor, ordering her to pay damages and issue a restraining order, I felt a rush of vindication so sharp it almost hurt. As we left the courthouse, Karen glared at me from across the lobby. Her voice, cold and steady, carried over the echoing tiles, "You'll regret making me look like a criminal." I didn't respond. I just walked out into the sunlight, holding Melissa's hand, feeling like we'd finally escaped the nightmare. But I could sense it, that this wasn't over. People like her don't let go. They linger, like a shadow that refuses to fade. And I was right. I thought the court verdict would bring peace, that once the law had spoken, the ghosts of that ordeal would finally disappear. But peace, I learned, doesn't come just because you earn it. Sometimes it refuses to come at all. The first few weeks after the ruling were calm, almost eerily so. Karen kept her distance, and for the first time in months, the street felt quiet. Liam was getting stronger, his cheeks fuller, his laugh returning. The sound of him running through the living room, pretending to be a superhero again, was the kind of noise I'd once taken for granted. Now it felt sacred. Every breath he took was a small miracle. Melissa and I started looking at houses outside the HOA community, somewhere rural, maybe with a big yard and no board members breathing down our necks. We'd even driven out one weekend to a small town about 30 miles away, where an old farmhouse sat on a hill surrounded by pine trees. The real estate agent smiled as she handed me the keys for a showing and said, "It's peaceful out here. No HOA, no nonsense." I remember the way Melissa's eyes softened when she heard that. For the first time, I started imagining a new beginning. A place where Liam could grow up without fear, where our family could finally exhale. But Karen wasn't done. It began subtly, like static in the background of an otherwise clear frequency. Small, petty things. Someone started leaving anonymous notes in our mailbox again, "Some people don't belong here." Or, "Rules exist for a reason." Sometimes, the letters came without words at all, just printed HOA bylaws highlighted in yellow. I brought one of them to Officer Thompson, but he sighed and said, "Without proof it's her, I can't do much." Could be any neighbor. Maybe it could have been. But deep down, I knew that handwriting, that sharp, overly neat script that looked like it had been written by a teacher correcting a student. Karen had a way of pressing down too hard with her pen, the indentations visible even on the next page. I'd seen her letters before, countless notices and complaints she'd slipped under doors for years. Then came the trash incident. One morning, as I was loading Liam into the car for a follow-up appointment, I found our garbage cans overturned, their contents spread across the lawn, shredded papers, empty prescription bottles, and a few medical supply boxes we'd thrown out. It looked deliberate. I checked the camera footage, the same cameras that had caught her months before, but somehow the feed from that night was corrupted. Static, distortion, and then black. It was as if someone had jammed the signal. Melissa started panicking again. "We can't live like this, Mark," she said one night, voice breaking. "She's obsessed. It's not just anger, it's something darker." She was right. Karen's obsession had evolved. What began as a power trip had become fixation, a need to reassert control after losing public face. The court ruling had humiliated her in front of the neighborhood, and I could tell she was the kind of person who'd rather burn the world down than admit defeat. I tried to shield Liam from the tension, pretending everything was fine. But one night, as I tucked him in, he looked at me with those clear, innocent eyes and asked, "Daddy, why does the lady across the street always look angry at us?" My throat tightened. "She just doesn't understand, buddy. Some people forget how to be kind." He nodded softly, clutching his stuffed bear, then said something that broke me, "Maybe I can show her how." It was the purest thing I'd ever heard. And at that moment, I realized how much damage one cruel person could do, not just to property or peace, but to the innocence of a child. A few days later, the tension boiled over again. I came home from work to find a code enforcement officer standing in my yard, clipboard in hand. Behind him, parked across the street, was Karen, watching. "Mr. Anderson?" the officer asked. "We received a report about an illegal electrical installation still active on your property." I blinked in disbelief. "There's no installation. Everything was removed months ago." He gestured toward the side of the house where the generator had once stood. "We just need to verify that." As I led him around, explaining everything, Karen shouted from across the road, "Make sure you check the wiring under the panel. He hides it." The officer frowned but stayed professional. When he finished, he said, "Everything looks fine here. Sorry for the disturbance, sir." I watched him drive away, my fists clenching until my knuckles turned white. Karen smirked, holding her phone up as if filming. "Just making sure you're following the rules," she called out sweetly. That night, Melissa broke down completely. "We have to move. I don't care if we sell this house at a loss. I can't live across from her anymore." So we made a decision, we'd leave within 2 weeks. I put the house on the market the next morning. But somehow, word spread faster than I could list it. Within days, every prospective buyer backed out. One realtor called me privately and said, "Look, I shouldn't say this, but someone's been calling potential buyers, telling them there's a history of electrical hazards and domestic disputes at your address." I didn't need to ask who. Karen was poisoning the well. I gathered evidence again, phone logs, voicemails from buyers, notes from the realtor. Erica, our lawyer, helped me file a harassment and defamation complaint. But the legal process moved like molasses, while Karen's attacks were immediate. It felt like trying to stop a storm with a bucket. Then came the night that changed everything, again. It was just past midnight. I was sitting in the living room, going over hospital bills and sale documents, when the power flickered. Once, twice, then went out completely. My first thought was that a transformer had blown, but when I stepped outside, every other house on the block still had lights. Only ours was dark. I grabbed my flashlight and went around the side of the house. The breaker box was open. I shone the light closer. The main switch had been flipped down, and next to it, scratched into the paint, were the words, "You should have followed the rules." For a moment, I just stood there in the cold, every muscle in my body tensed, listening to the silence. Then I heard it, the faint creak of a gate closing somewhere nearby. I ran toward the street, scanning for movement, but whoever it was, if it was her, had vanished. I called the police again, filed yet another report, and showed them the scratch marks. Officer Thompson, looking older and more tired than ever, sighed. "This is harassment, no doubt. But without footage or a direct witness, I know," I cut him off, my voice trembling with restrained fury. "Without proof, it's nothing." After he left, I walked back inside, turned the power back on, and sat in the dark living room for a long time. I could feel the rage simmering inside me, not the kind that explodes, but the kind that burns slow and deep, the kind that changes a person. Melissa suggested staying with her sister for a while, just until things settled. I didn't argue. We packed essentials the next morning and drove to her sister's house an hour away. Liam thought it was a vacation. For him, everything was an adventure, sleeping in a new bed, watching cartoons late, eating pancakes for dinner. I envied that simplicity. But I couldn't shake the sense that Karen was still reaching for us, even from afar. I started getting calls from unknown numbers. Silence on the line. Sometimes faint breathing. Once, a distorted voice whispered, "Cowards run. Rules stay." Erica advised us to record everything and hand it to the police. I did. But even with that, the authorities said tracing the calls would take time. Then, one afternoon, while we were still at Melissa's sister's place, I got an alert on my phone from one of the house cameras. The motion sensor had triggered. I opened the feed, expecting maybe a stray cat or raccoon. But what I saw made my blood run cold. There, standing in our driveway in broad daylight, was Karen. She was holding a small hammer, tapping something onto the front door, a notice, or maybe another taunt. Then she turned, looked straight into the camera, and smiled. That smile, cold, triumphant, almost amused, told me everything. This wasn't over. She wanted to prove that even after the court, the fines, the restraining order, she still held power. I called the police again, and this time, they didn't hesitate. They caught her within the hour, still walking down the street, carrying the hammer and a bag filled with printed flyers. She was charged again, this time for violating the restraining order and stalking. The district attorney himself called me to confirm it. "We're pushing for a full restraining order expansion, statewide," he said. "She's crossed a serious line." When I told Melissa, she broke into tears. But this time, they weren't tears of fear, they were tears of release. For the first time in a long while, we felt safe enough to breathe again. A month later, we closed on the farmhouse in Pine Hollow, a quiet, open place surrounded by trees and silence. The day we moved in, Liam ran through the fields chasing butterflies, his laughter echoing across the hills. I stood on the porch, looking out at the horizon, feeling like I could finally exhale. But even in peace, memories cling. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind rustles through the trees or the generator hums softly in the barn, I still hear her voice in my head, "Rules are rules." I've come to realize that people like Karen don't just enforce rules, they hide behind them. They weaponize them to control, to dominate, to erase empathy. What she did wasn't about wires or bylaws, it was about power, and what happens when someone believes their sense of order outweighs another person's life. I promised myself that I'd tell this story someday, not out of bitterness, but as a warning. Because if there's one thing I've learned through all this, it's that evil doesn't always come wearing a mask or holding a weapon. Sometimes, it comes holding a clipboard and a smile. And if you let it, it'll convince you it's just doing its job. The days that followed felt like a blur of motion and emotion, the kind of days that reshape a man's sense of right and wrong, of justice and injustice. After the police had taken Karen away, after the chaos had finally quieted down, the hospital corridors began to feel calm again. Machines hummed normally, nurses went about their duties, and my son's room was filled not with panic, but with the soft beeping of stability. I sat by his bed, holding his tiny hand in mine, feeling the faint pulse of life that I'd almost lost because of someone else's cruelty. Every rise and fall of his chest felt like a miracle, a victory carved out of madness. But even in that peace, a storm brewed quietly inside me. I wasn't a man given to revenge, but this wasn't something I could just forgive or forget. Karen hadn't just tried to sabotage my property or my peace of mind, she had crossed a line into something vile, something that nearly ended my child's life. And in my heart, I knew, people like her don't stop unless they're stopped for good. The HOA board, as always, tried to spin the story. They sent me a notice of concern, claiming that my accusations against Karen were slanderous and unsubstantiated. They wrote about community harmony and due process, as if the footage of her tampering with hospital equipment wasn't evidence enough. I remember laughing bitterly as I read it, sitting there beside my recovering son, surrounded by the very machines she'd tried to ruin. The hypocrisy was staggering. They didn't care about the truth, they cared about saving their own image. But this time, I wasn't going to play by their rules. The doctor, who had seen everything, stood with me. He provided a detailed statement to the police, outlining exactly what had happened, and the hospital administration backed us up. For once, the system worked as it should. Charges were filed, tampering with medical equipment, endangering a minor, criminal trespass. And yet, the HOA still refused to condemn her publicly. Their silence told me everything I needed to know about what kind of community they really were. As the legal process unfolded, the neighborhood began to shift. People whispered behind closed doors, some avoided me entirely, afraid of getting caught in the fallout. Others, people who had once been silent, started reaching out, sharing their own horror stories about Karen and the HOA. One neighbor told me how Karen had once turned off a construction worker's power because his truck was too noisy. Another said she had reported their teenage daughter for public disturbance, just for playing music on the porch. Each story painted a clearer picture of a woman who had been emboldened for years, unchecked by the very system that was supposed to maintain order. And for the first time, the community began to question its own foundations. The HOA board meetings, once smugly predictable, turned into battlegrounds. I attended every single one, standing in the back, saying nothing at first, just watching them squirm as the truth bled through their polished smiles. Then came the day of the hearing. Karen showed up in a pressed navy suit, her hair perfectly styled, her expression a mask of cold arrogance. But beneath that facade, I could see the cracks, the twitch in her jaw, the way her eyes darted whenever the prosecutor mentioned the footage. The courtroom was silent when they played the video, Karen sneaking into the restricted ward, pulling at wires, whispering angrily to herself. You could hear the faint beeping of the machines in the background, and then the flatline alarm. Gasps filled the room. I didn't look at her, I couldn't. My focus was on my son's photo in my pocket, the one I had carried through every sleepless night. When the verdict came, guilty on all charges, there was no satisfaction in it, only relief. She was sentenced to prison time, and for once, justice didn't feel abstract. It felt real. But even then, part of me wondered how someone could carry so much hate that they'd risk a child's life over a homeowner's dispute. What kind of soul did it take to cross that line? After the trial, the HOA tried to recover its reputation. They called an emergency meeting, inviting all homeowners to discuss future reforms. I went, not out of interest, but out of obligation. The president gave a long speech about restoring trust and moving forward, but every word rang hollow. When they opened the floor for comments, I stood up. The room went silent. Moving forward, I said slowly, starts with accountability. Not just for Karen, for all of you who let this happen. Faces turned red, eyes dropped, a few people shifted uncomfortably. I told them everything, about the harassment, the intimidation, the blind eye they'd turned while Karen terrorized the neighborhood. I didn't raise my voice, didn't curse, didn't lose control. I just spoke the truth, plainly, painfully. And by the time I finished, the room was quiet in a different way, not from fear, but from shame. That night, several board members resigned. Within a month, the HOA dissolved entirely. The bylaws were voided, the community became self-managed, and the sign at the neighborhood entrance, "Welcome to Oakwood Estates, HOA managed," was taken down. I kept one of the letters from the board as a reminder: power without empathy is just tyranny in disguise. Life didn't instantly return to normal, but it slowly healed. My son grew stronger every day, laughing again, playing again. The doctor who had called the police became a family friend. Sometimes, he'd visit for dinner, and we'd talk about everything except that night. My wife started gardening again, something she hadn't done since the HOA fined us for unauthorized soil alteration. Our yard bloomed in color, wild and free. And as for me, I found peace in simplicity, morning walks, quiet evenings, the hum of life without interference. But deep down, I carried a quiet resolve, a promise that I'd never again let anyone use authority as a weapon. I'd seen what that kind of unchecked power could do. Karen's story had become a cautionary tale in our town, a reminder that community should mean care, not control. Sometimes, late at night, I'd stand by my son's door, watching him sleep. The soft glow of the nightlight reflected on the medical bracelet still hanging from his wrist, a symbol of survival, of how close we'd come to losing everything. And in those quiet moments, I'd whisper to myself, never again. Because no homeowner's rule, no community policy, no self-righteous neighbor should ever come before humanity. What Karen tried to destroy had only made us stronger, not through revenge, but through resilience. And though the scars remained, they told a story of endurance, of light outlasting darkness. That was our justice. That was our closure. Months turned into a year, and life gradually stitched itself back together, thread by thread. The chaos that had once consumed every moment of my existence began to fade into something distant, like an echo you can still hear but no longer feel. The neighborhood looked the same on the surface, the same neat lawns, the same tree-lined streets, but underneath, it was different now. People had changed. They smiled more freely, spoke without fear, and greeted one another without looking over their shoulders for approval. The absence of the HOA had loosened something in all of us, a kind of invisible grip that had kept the entire community in quiet submission. Now, without their endless rules and Karen's constant surveillance, people started living again. It was strange how peace could feel so unfamiliar after so much conflict. But for me, the calm was not empty, it was healing. Every morning, when I stepped onto the porch with a cup of coffee, I'd see my son playing in the yard, his laughter carried on the wind like a song I never wanted to end. That sound reminded me of why I had fought, not for pride or revenge, but for freedom, for safety, for the simple right to live without fear. The media had caught wind of what happened, of course. Local news called it the HOA tampering scandal, and for a few weeks, reporters swarmed our small town like vultures. They wanted interviews, headlines, exclusives. I declined them all. I wasn't interested in fame, and I didn't want my son's face on television. But the story took on a life of its own. People across the country started questioning their own homeowners associations, their own so-called community leaders. Social media buzzed with outrage and solidarity. I received hundreds of letters and emails, from fathers, mothers, even retirees, thanking me for standing up, for not letting the system bury what happened. Some told me they had faced similar tyranny in their neighborhoods, that they too had been silenced by people who hid behind bylaws and regulations. It was humbling, in a strange way, to realize that what had felt like a deeply personal nightmare had become part of a bigger conversation about power, control, and decency. Maybe, in some small way, my son's pain had sparked something larger, a reminder that rules should protect people, not punish them. One afternoon, almost a year to the day after the incident, I received a letter from the hospital. It wasn't a bill or a form, it was an invitation. The same doctor who had called the police that night had nominated me for a local, Community Courage Award. I remember staring at the paper for a long moment, unsure how to feel. Part of me didn't think I deserved it. I hadn't been brave, I'd been desperate. But my wife insisted we go. So, a few weeks later, we found ourselves sitting in a small auditorium, surrounded by people whose lives had been touched by moments of darkness and defiance. When my name was called, and I walked up to the stage, I looked out into the crowd and saw my son sitting in the front row, smiling proudly. That was the moment I realized the true meaning of courage. It isn't about standing tall in public, it's about refusing to fall apart when the world tries to break you. I didn't give a long speech, just said, sometimes doing what's right costs you everything, but doing nothing costs even more. The applause that followed wasn't loud, it was genuine, heartfelt, and real. After the ceremony, the doctor approached me, his expression calm but thoughtful. "You know," he said, "if I hadn't been there that night, I'm not sure what would have happened." I shook his hand and told him the truth. If you hadn't called the police, I wouldn't have faith in people anymore. He smiled faintly and said, "That's why we have to look out for each other, because systems fail, but people can still choose to care." Those words stuck with me. They became a quiet mantra in my life. I started volunteering part-time at a local outreach program that helped families dealing with medical emergencies, teaching them how to advocate for their rights, how to navigate insurance, how to fight when no one listens. I wasn't trying to be a hero, I just didn't want anyone else to feel as helpless as I once had. The work gave me purpose. Every parent I helped, every frightened voice I reassured, felt like a piece of redemption. My life, once defined by bitterness, began to feel full again. Karen remained in prison for several years. Occasionally, I'd get letters from reporters asking if I wanted to comment on her case, but I never responded. I didn't need to know what became of her. The law had handled her fate, I had moved on. What mattered now was what came after. Our neighborhood evolved. The same people who once followed the HOA's every order now organized block parties, charity drives, and cleanup events. We'd share meals, laugh together, even help one another fix fences or plant trees. Without control, there was connection. Without power, there was unity. And in those small acts of community, I found something I hadn't felt in years: belonging. Sometimes, when the sky turned gold in the evening, I'd sit on the porch and think back to that night in the hospital. I could still see the flashing lights, the fear in my wife's eyes, the sterile smell of antiseptic mixing with the cold weight of panic. But now, those memories didn't hurt the same way. They were scars, not wounds. And scars, I realized, don't just remind us of pain, they remind us of survival. They tell us where we've been and how far we've come. I watched my son chase fireflies across the lawn, his laughter echoing under the fading light, and I knew that we had turned tragedy into something unbreakable. The world could be cruel, people could be heartless, but there would always be those who chose compassion over control, courage over convenience. That night, after everyone had gone to sleep, I walked out into the yard, barefoot on the cool grass. The air was quiet, peaceful, almost sacred. I looked up at the stars and whispered a silent thank you, to the doctor, to the officers who believed me, to every person who stood on the side of what was right. But most of all, to my son, who had unknowingly given me the strength to fight when I wanted to give up. Because of him, I had faced something dark and come out stronger. Because of him, I had learned that justice isn't about punishment, it's about protection. I glanced at our house, the lights glowing softly through the windows, and realized something simple yet profound: we were finally free. Not just from Karen, not just from the HOA, but from fear itself. And that's the part of the story I hold on to. The part where peace isn't given, it's earned. Where love outlasts hate, and ordinary people rise when the world tries to silence them. The HOA had once ruled through fear, but fear has no power when people stand together. I smiled to myself, took one last look at the stars, and went back inside. My family was asleep, safe and warm, and for the first time in years, I felt like the world was exactly as it should be. And if I've learned anything through all of this, it's that even the darkest nights end in dawn, and no one, not even a self-righteous HOA Karen, can stop the light from coming back.